Hello again. Somebody this morning, I won't mention any names, made a snarky comment here about the way that serious historians don't publish on right-wing YouTube channels. Ouch. Of course, to be fair, the last 17 books on history that I have written have actually been published by Pen and Sword Books, which is one of the leading publishers of history, especially military history in this country. But we'll let that pass. I give a link to these books in the description to this video. But let us consider for a moment the concept of the serious historian, writing on the same kind of topics which I cover. What sort of things do such people say? Historians do not, I feel, come any more serious than Caroline Dodds Pennock, who is Senior Lecturer in International History at the University of Sheffield. She specialises in the history of the Aztecs, a point to which I shall return shortly, and has recently had a book published called On Savage Shores: How Indigenous Americans Discovered Europe. You see what she's done there, subverted our traditional view of the case by talking of the Americans discovering Europe rather than the actual situation, which is, of course, that the Europeans discovered America. An interview with Miss Dodds Pennock is published in the February edition of the BBC History magazine, which, according to the masthead, is Britain's best-selling history magazine. Here is the issue in question. Available from all good newsagents and bookshops. Price £6.50. Well, it's a little pricey, but there you go. The cover features this catchy quotation. Europe was a much more savage place than the Americas. What indigenous Americans thought of 16th century Europe? Gosh, that's controversial, isn't it? Was Renaissance Europe really a more savage place than the Americas at that time? It sounds improbable, but there can be no doubt that Caroline Dodds Pennock really is a serious historian, and since it is she who has said this, we must look inside and see what to make of this claim. Let's see now. Allow me to read out from the interview, because I feel that I should quote the actual words of the person who is propagating such an idea. Just to be clear, she is talking here not just of Native Americans in North America. She states explicitly that she is speaking generally of the whole of the two continents, that is to say, North America, South America, the Caribbean, and the Arctic. A book concerns those from the Americas who were brought to Europe, sometimes against their will, and the impressions they gleaned of Europe at this time. We know this is what she is covering because once this question is asked, here we are. What did indigenous Americans make of European societies that they encountered? She says, we're obviously talking about the hugely diverse range of peoples, from the Inuit in the north of what is now Canada down to people in Brazil. So that's the range of people whose views she's considering when she's describing how they encountered Europe and their views and opinions on Europe at that time. Now, let's see what she says here. This is one of her answers to the questions. It's one reason to support the idea that Europe was more savage than the Americas at that time. Beating children was a thing they were surprised by. They had different ideas about childhood and didn't understand using violence against people you were supposed to care for. So they were very much more gentle than us, seemingly. However, as soon as I read this, I smelled a rat, and I will explain why. I have an interest in the history of childhood, and I've written 3 books on this subject. I remember when researching years ago coming across some horrifying details of the way in which naughty children were published in the Aztec Empire. One way, and it may be seen in the thumbnail to this video, was for parents to stab their children in the arms with razor-sharp cactus spines until blood was drawn. We can see a little girl being punished in this way in the thumbnail to this video, and you can see the representation of tears coming from her eyes. Another way of disciplining children was to start a small fire and throw chilies onto it. Then the child would be trussed up like a chicken and his or her face held over the burning chilies with horrific consequences. It would lead to blistering of the face, choking, and other extremely unpleasant effects. It was like being exposed to tear gas. I give a link to a bit about this in the description to this video. What did the expert on Aztec history say about this? Ah, yes, they had different ideas about childhood and didn't understand using violence against people you were supposed to care for. Hmm. So those visiting Europe were shocked to see children being spanked, but thought it okay to stab them repeatedly with sharp spines from a cactus. Have I got that right? Hmm. More research needed on this, I think. This is all very peculiar, of course, and I can think of only two possible explanations. One would be that Caroline Dodds Pennock does not know about the way that the Aztecs treated their children. Since she is seemingly an expert on Aztec history, this seems to me to be vanishingly unlikely. The other possibility would be that she is deliberately distorting things so that she is able to show that the indigenous Americans were more gentle, kind, and caring than those awful Europeans. This would fit the narrative beloved of the BBC that all evils come from white Europeans and that until we travelled round the world, everybody lived in perfect peace, harmony, and equality. Why else were indigenous Americans horrified at what they found in 16th century Europe and thought that it was more savage than their own continents? Let's see. Da, da, da. They were horrified by inequalities in European society and didn't understand how people with vast wealth could live right beside others in abject poverty. Again, I'm guessing that an expert like this must know that the Aztec emperor lived in a huge palace and that some of his subjects did indeed live in abject poverty, just like Europe, really. We know that Caroline Dodds Pennock is talking about the impressions of people from the Aztec Empire because she says above that she's talking about the archives relating to people from Central and South America. These archives, their life stories explain what happened to them, including information about their lives and how they were kidnapped. Then there's the Cantares Mexicanos, a collection of 16th century songs and poems by indigenous people, which they would have recorded these stories in a popular oral tradition, and they include stories of travel. She is specifically talking here about people in Central America, about the Aztecs. What's more, ah yes, slavery. She is asked this question. Though part of the wider story of slavery, the enslavement of indigenous American peoples is an aspect with which many in Europe might not be so familiar. What can you tell us about it? Hmm. She rambles on for some while, and it is clear that the only slavery she is talking about is that which involves Europeans enslaving indigenous Americans. Again, I'm pretty sure that she must know about the slave markets in the Aztec capital, where slaves were bought and sold by the Aztecs. That's what you call chattel slavery. Nothing to do with Europeans. She probably knows too about slavery among the tribes of North America. What are we to make of all this? Well, one conclusion we can draw is that serious historians and academics cannot always be trusted, especially when it comes to the interviews which they give to the BBC. Is this woman actually ignorant about the history of the Americas, including the Aztec Empire? Or is she deliberately trying to give the impression that they were kinder to their children and had more of an interest in equality than people in Europe at that time? I think I should really leave viewers to decide that for themselves.